Well, welcome to our topic, tight topics. This one's going to be on sharpening. Sharpening is quite an extensive topic, so it might be a little longer than I want it to be. I've already tried this topic 2 or 3 times, and it gets too long. We'll try to make this short. There's 3 kinds of topics, 3 kinds of sharpening in this topic. One is called input sharpening. It's a sharpening that happens either in your camera or when you import it into Lightroom, and I'm looking at Lightroom right now. It differs whether the file is a raw file like this one on the right here, this NEF file, or a JPEG file like this one here. Okay, so the input sharpening differs. Second kind of sharpening is creative sharpening. Is the sharpening you apply either in Photoshop or Lightroom after the file has been imported. And it might even include selective sharpening to specific parts of the image to enhance those areas. For example, eyes in a portrait. The final kind of sharpening is output sharpening, which happens when you export a picture, and that depends on the kind of media you're exporting to. For example, if it's matte paper, gloss paper, high gloss paper, or a web for a screen or a presentation. So the sharpening for those differ for pictures. So there's 3 kinds of sharpening. Let's look at input sharpening, and I'm going to start off with the raw file here. If I go to the Develop module in Lightroom just to see, and I look at what's happening, I look at the Detail tab here, and I go down and look at sharpening, you can see that 40 has already been applied to this thing. If I look at all the other sliders in this Lightroom, there's nothing's been applied to anything. Even if I hit reset on this picture, okay, I hit reset, I go down to the Detail slider, still it's going to have 40 applied. So Lightroom by default applies 40 to the raw file. The reason for that is raw files are not processed, and there's been no sharpening applied by the camera. This file could easily take a lot more sharpening to it, and the way you would do that simply is by sliding the slider up, right? So I could give it 100 here. I could probably zoom into the picture a bit. So let's go to 1:1 to zoom in to see the kind of effect I'm having on sharpening, and then I can change the slider and see what I've got. I'm looking at the wood grain here, and this picture can easily take about that amount of sharpening at least. Okay, radius is the amount of radius around the edges that Lightroom is looking at to apply sharpening. What sharpening actually is not what you think it is. It's actually edge contrast. That's tricking your eye into thinking the picture is more sharp. So it's just looking around the edges of where it finds an edge, and it's looking how far out around the edge is it applying that contrast. Detail is small detail. For example, if I look at the wood grain here and I run the detail up, I should get more in that grain. Okay, and that's not bad. I can run the detail up on that. What happens when you start to do this is noise. So that's what the purpose of this last slider here. If I go back to the whole picture and start using this masking tool here, I can get rid of noise that would otherwise appear. Because I do like the sharpening on the boat here, and possibly the leaves and everything, but not in the sky. So the way to get rid of that is hold down the Option or Alt key if you're on a Windows machine, and then while you hold the Option or Alt key down, slide the mask. You'll notice the mask is all white. We've talked about white mask reveal, black mask conceal. So just like that, like in Photoshop, the white mask here reveals all the sharpening all across the picture. As I slide it to the right, it starts to conceal some areas with black. Okay, so it's taking the sharpening off where you see it black. So I can keep on sliding it until I see it's taking it off where I don't want it. I can keep going, and I'll say, okay, that's probably okay. I want sharpening where I see it there. I can go all the way over. This is one I'm really trying to take it off the sky mostly in the flat areas. So that I would do that. Now that this picture has been sharpened quite a bit without any effect in the sky and stuff like that. As this last piece that we just did here by moving the slider up, once we went past 40, I'll call that creative sharpening. It's what I've added to the picture to do some additional sharpening to it. Let's go back now. I'm going to reset this picture because I'm going to go into Photoshop and do some stuff. So I'll reset the pictures back to 40 now. If I take a JPEG file, just to show you the difference, and go to the Develop module, there's 0 sharpening applied. And the reason that there's no sharpening applied is that the JPEG is a processed file. The camera applied sharpening. and it applied a certain amount. I don't know what. Again, you can apply your own sharpening here, and we should be creative sharpening at that time. Let's go into Photoshop now and explore how Photoshop does the sharpening. I'm doing Command E or Control E to bring in Photoshop. You can also, of course, right click and bring it up in Photoshop. Okay. Now we're in Photoshop. Sorry about that, a little glitch in the system here. We're in Photoshop, and we can start doing the sharpening. Now, if I just for interest's sake, the picture is here. If I were to go to Adobe Camera Raw and see what I can do here, bring it down here. So if I go to Filter, Adobe Camera Raw, just to see if that 40 is still being applied. Remember the 40 that we saw in Lightroom, and I go down to look at the detail area. So if I go down to detail down here, I'll notice that sharpening is 0 here. It was 40 in Lightroom, it's 0 here. The reason for that is when this file came into Photoshop from Lightroom, Lightroom applied the 40 to it and brought it in here. So it does have the 40 applied, it just doesn't show it here. Anything I do now is creative sharpening. Okay, so that's and one way to sharpen in Photoshop is to jump into Camera Raw and start using these same sliders that you used in Lightroom. Let's go back to Photoshop and look at the Photoshop sharpening tools. First of all, I'm going to copy the image. Sorry, hit it twice. Didn't mean to do that. Copy the image, Control J, go to Filter, and Sharpen. You'll notice there's a lot of sharpening tools. Shake reduction is pretty interesting. I've never really got it to work well, but if you have a slight shake in the camera, shake reduction will try to find the shake and reduce it. I won't go through that now. There's the Sharpen tool, Sharpen Edges, Sharpen More, and Smart Sharpen. Unsharp Mask is the one that most people use, and that's the one I'll use now. It's a funny term, unsharp mask, but that's what it is. This looks a lot like Lightroom in a way. You can take the sharpening up as much as you'd like to go. I'll zoom into the picture. It's already got sharpening applied from Lightroom, that 40, but I can look here, and of course it's got some sharpening applied here. So as I go back and forth here, it'll make a slight difference on the wood texture. You can see that. Bring it up, the sharpening here. Radius is the same thing as Lightroom. It goes further out from the center, but it gives me a lot more radius. Lightroom only gives me 1 or 2 pixels here. It's probably not a good idea to put the pixels out too far, because the further out I go, the more haloing and more artifacts I get. So it's good to keep the radius really low, so 1 to 2, something like that. And threshold is just the amount of contrast it's looking for between edges, what it considers an edge by the amount of contrast. So if the threshold is 0, it's going to consider almost everything an edge. It's very sensitive. And as I move this up, it'll consider less and less an edge. It'll essentially do less sharpening. Okay. So I keep the thresholds usually pretty low. Just to keep the threshold very low, keep the radius low, and use the sharpening slider. Okay, you can see the preview here by clicking on and off. You can see the image behind is moving around. Okay, you can move this little preview window around here. It doesn't do me much. I like to see the image there. Okay, so that's creative sharpening in Lightroom using the unsharp mask tool. You can do selective sharpening. And then use a high-pass filter. Those would be the other 2 ways of doing it. In Photoshop, you can also use outside programs like Topaz, which is a plugin to do sharpening. And I don't use Topaz, but it's supposed to do some really fantastic work. If I want to do some selective sharpening on this picture, so I could zoom out, and let's say I wanted to do some extra sharpening on the boat itself, but not touch the rest of the picture. There's several ways I can do that. Going down to layers here, okay. One way I can do that is to go over to the Sharpen tool on the left-hand side over here, this little triangle with a sharp point on it. It's the Sharpen tool, right? Selecting, using a brush, okay, and it's always good to start with have a soft brush. Don't have the hardness up. Soft brush. You can select the size of the brush here. I'm going to be painting on the wood, so I need a slightly bigger brush than that. That's probably fine. I can make the brush smaller or larger as I get there. And now what I can do is I can go in here, and I'll go in closely so you can see what I'm doing, and I can brush on a particular piece of the picture and sharpen just those areas as I go through here. So if you have an animal, a bird, and you want to sharpen the eyes, you can sharpen those eyes up. So you can see what I'm doing in the areas I've sharpened. I've sharpened over here, and I've sharpened this area here. If I go now to the history panel and taken this sharpening tool and go back to before I sharpen it all, watch the difference. Okay. So that sharpening tool is one way to do the selective sharpening. Okay. Another way to do the selective sharpening, we can go to layers here. I could go to I could go copy that layer. Okay, now I copy that layer. I can go back and apply a sharpening tool such as we did before, which would be the unsharp mask. I can go out and do some additional sharpening with it. Just say that it's already there. It is really looking crunchy, too much, but that's for effect, so you can see what's happening. And then to do the selective sharpening at that point, I would mask this new sharp layer, but I would put a black mask on it. So instead of just clicking the mask, I'll hit Alt click. So I'm holding down the Alt or Option key and clicking. It fills it now with black. If I now use a white brush, white is my foreground color, I can now paint in the sharpening wherever I want. So if you look at this particular piece of the picture, where I painted this log here, where I painted here, let's run the opacity up all the way just so we can get the real effect here. And now if I click this one on and off, you see I brought more sharpening into that area. So there's really two ways of doing the selective sharpening, using this tool here or using the masking technique. And now finally let's go back to Lightroom to see what output sharpening is like. Take any picture here. I'll just take the one we've been using. If I go to the export, to export this picture, I'll choose whatever presets I want over here. But among the things that you have to choose is output sharpening, or you should choose as output sharpening. So if I want to send this out as a full-size JPEG, I would click on output sharpening. I want this to go out on screen, matte paper. Let's say matte paper absorbs more ink. It's going to make the picture look softer. So for matte paper, I'm going to say yes, standard. But I can say, depending on my own experiences, what I like, I say standard or high or whatever, and then I can hit export, and this will export as a JPEG, and I send it to the printer. So that's output sharpening, and that's it. Right now, that's some of the sharpening techniques. There is one more technique of sharpening in Photoshop, which is not under the sharpening tool. It's not under any of those things. What we'll do is we'll go back to the history panel and set this picture back to where it was before. This is the beginning picture. The way this technique works here, okay, is you get the picture itself, copy the picture, right? I can then, on that copied picture, I'll turn it into a smart object. The reason I want to do that is I want to be able to iterate back and forth on this particular technique until I get it right. I don't want to have just one pass and then have to accept it. So now it's a smart object. It got the smart object icon on it. Okay, I'll do image adjustments, black and white. It's turned it black and white. I'll just leave it like that. Now that I've got the object, the layer black and white, I can go to filter, other, high pass. This is called high pass sharpening, and it's a very popular way of sharpening by a lot of people. In my own opinion, it's the best way of sharpening in Photoshop. So high pass sharpening, the way this works is, first of all, just put the radius all the way to the left, and you see just a gray piece of gray screen. As I move this to the right, you'll notice, remember the sharpening is finding edges and adding contrast to that edges. So as I bring this out, you start to see the edges along in this picture. And the more I bring it out, of course, I bring it way out, it shows me too much. So I'll bring it out till I just want to have that. And the reason now this is a smart object is I'll probably want to iterate back and forth on this a little bit. So I'll bring it out to a certain degree. Okay, and a little bit more maybe. Okay, so I can see some of the edges. I think I'll maybe even bring it out a little bit harder. That's going to be too much. I don't really want to bring it out too much beyond just seeing the edges here. And then once I've got that set up, I change the blend mode here to one of these down here. Overlay, soft light, or hard light. Hard light seems to do real nice with this one here. And vivid light. Nah, I don't like vivid light too much. Hard light's what I would do with this one. And you can see as I click this on and off the amount of sharpening it's done. And this seems to add a lot of sharpening without adding a lot of noise, so I like this. As I go in, you can see the high pass sharpening on this image is quite dramatic. Good. I hope you learned something and hope you enjoyed this. And we'll have more of these topics.